Gabe Kaminsky is a Washington Examiner investigative reporter, and a very good one. Gabe, how are you, my friend?
Mark, thanks for having me.
You wrote a really thorough, deep dive piece on George Soros, the FCC, and the acquisition of 220 stations. I've been talking about this on my program, but you really did a very, very deep dive. What did you find?
Yeah, I really appreciate having me on again. What we reported in the Washington Examiner, as you described there, kind of a deep dive into how entities funded by George Soros and connected to George Soros, one of the top Democratic mega donors, recently were approved by the Federal Communications Commission just weeks before the 2024 presidential election to take over 200 radio stations controlled by Odyssey, which is actually the second largest radio broadcaster in the United States. But really an important part, and something we learned as we investigated this, is that Republicans on the Federal Communications Commission, as well as in Congress, are taking significant issue with how the FCC handled this matter. And it's something, we spoke about this, right? We interviewed you for this article, and you raised concerns over the notion that FCC seemingly fast-tracked this deal, in that they allowed entities in which have over 25% foreign ownership to sort of bypass standard procedure and be allowed to purchase radio stations when, again, the FCC, as you've described on this program for a long time now, does not allow typically groups controlled with 25% or more in foreign ownership. And in this case, they still allowed, a Democratic mega donor, the Biden-Harris administration, to take over these radio stations.
Now, isn't it amazing? It is to me anyway. The extent to which the broadcast media, I'm not talking about radio, I'm talking about, cable networks and so forth, pretend this didn't even happen. I mean, your report is the most thorough of any report I've read.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I think I do believe it's really important, and not only because, and to break it down further, I think, so the FCC, they have this rule in which companies in bankruptcy transactions like this, so Odyssey, this broadcaster, went bankrupt. In order for the transaction, so when Soros wants to, his groups want to buy Odyssey, if it's determined that there's over 25% or more foreign ownership, in which they determined the Soros back groups did, that would typically mean that they would have to relinquish that foreign ownership, or they would not be able to make that acquisition. In this case, it's actually kind of wild. Essentially, what happened here is that Odyssey was allowed to issue these things called special warrants, or IOUs, to its foreign stakeholders, which essentially dropped Odyssey temporarily before the deal went through below that 25% foreign threshold. But now after, they're just going to begin to have foreign ownership again. And here's the really important thing, Mark, that I think your listeners should be aware of. Republicans are really chiefly concerned also because they don't even know what foreign interests are linked to this deal. That's something that would be investigated in a national security review that is not taking place right now, but actually after the deal already went through.
Now, these procedures have been in place almost 20 years. I went back and looked. Never been done for anybody else before. It's done right before the election. You've got some significant conservative talk stations in the bundle of stations out of the 220. And I think it was the CEO of Sinclair who said, so what they'll do is they'll sit it out a little while, then in 6 or 12 months or whatever, then they'll start purifying the stations, like he did to Spanish stations in South Florida, including one conservative Cuban station, right? Isn't that what he said?
Yeah, that was Reed Rubenstein, former U.S. Deputy Attorney General, connected to America First Legal. But what Mr. Rubenstein had raised concerns about was what you had described there, which is that the sort of concerns that a sort of wealthy billionaire, in this case a Democrat, is purchasing all these radio stations, and that there are right-of-center radio stations. And we know what Mr. Rubenstein's concerns are based on are other examples in which this billionaire, George Soros, and other billionaires certainly have sort of gotten involved in the media space. I mean, we reported at the Examiner a long time ago, or last year rather, something I believe I joined this program about was how George Soros funded a group called the Global Disinformation Index, a British group that took steps to blacklist conservative media outlets from advertising dollars. We've also reported on how Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn co-founder and another mega donor, how he's funded efforts to get involved in media. And so Mr. David Smith, the Sinclair Broadcast Group executive chairman, who you mentioned there, he actually was describing to us at the Examiner how he wonders where conservative mega donors are. Why aren't they necessarily getting involved in the media space as much?
I think that's a pretty good question, don't you? I mean, other than Elon Musk, who certainly got involved with Twitter, doesn't seem to be too much of that. And Sinclair is a huge outfit, and I think he raises a very good point, don't you? At least when it comes to radio.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, and you know, if you look at the media space, and actually, you know, I'd say this: Leonard Leo, co-chairman of the Federalist Society, chairman of an influential conservative PR firm in Washington, D.C. called CRC Advisors, he recently put out a memo to organizations that he helped support, essentially calling on them to weaponize or in his telling, or use conservative ideas in more activist-oriented ways. And actually, Leo, in that letter to his groups, was calling on wealthy conservatives to get more involved in the media space or more involved in the art space, as Scott Walter of Capital Research Center pointed out to us. There's long been a sort of debate on the right about where wealthy people should be placing their money. But I think a concern is that a lot of that money on the right often goes to sort of dormant foundations that, you know, produce policy white papers and sit on large amounts of money, as opposed to sort of maybe trying to enact change through the arts or the media space.
You know, a friend of mine who owns a few newspapers in Tennessee sent me a piece after he read your piece. Your piece has made it, I mean, it's been bouncing around all over the country now. And he sent me information about some story that was done that Soros has been buying up all these local newspapers, too. Had you heard about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure which program it is, but I would note that what we've reported and what others have reported is how there's been a operation called Courier News, a Democratic-aligned news network, or purportedly news network, and essentially Courier News is funded by billionaires and mega donors aligned with the left, and what the nonpartisan watchdog Open Secrets had reported actually. Is that Courier News, it's not really a news network, rather it's just pushing out, you know, talking points aligned with a certain political orientation. But so I am aware of George Soros being involved with that news network, and, you know, its parent company is a group called Acronym that also funds these local news. And so I think the local news, you know, sort of angle of this is actually also an interesting one to explore, which is that's something I believe Leo Network might want to get involved in, is that local news across the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great piece. I posted it on all my social sites by Gabe Kaminsky, Washington Examiner investigative reporter. I urge you to read it, and apparently thousands are reading it, and spread the word. Gabe, great job. You're a real reporter, and we appreciate that, my friend.